in Psycho, the Gothic house and the horizontal motel form a deliberate architectural composition. He says, I felt that kind of architecture would help the atmosphere of the yarn, definitely. That's a composition, a vertical block and a horizontal block. Hitchcock's juxtaposition of the two architectures amplifies the acceleration of terror in both settings. Milieus and architecture have always the same role in Hitchcock's films. They function as psychic amplifiers of the story. Characteristically, his films start off in an idyllic and relaxed atmosphere. Scenes and buildings reflect a somewhat naive and amusing balance of bourgeois life. As the story begins, however, a sense of foreboding begins to convey a negative content to the buildings. The very same architecture turns gradually into a generator and container of fear, and in the end, terror seems to have poisoned space itself. The comfortable flat in Rope, which film we are going to see tomorrow, slowly makes its hidden dreadful side visible. Bodega Bay, the charming North Californian resort village in the birds, turns into a bewitched scene of fear and disaster that does not grant anyone a means of exit. The Manhattan rental apartment block in Rear Window, the scene of harmless episodes of quotidian life, turns into a labyrinth of fear. In Hitchcock's films, suspense takes over the viewer to the degree that even the evident stage unreality of his cinematic buildings or their architectural incredibility, as the painted urban scene in urban silhouette in Rear Window, the miniaturized Manhattan in Rope, and the naively painted harbor set in Marnie can no longer discharge the alleviate the reality of fear. In the upper one, the Manhattan behind there with in the evening light, that's clearly a painted canvas. And similarly, the harbor scene in Marnie is a painted canvas, but it doesn't matter. The fear has already conquered our soul, and we believe in everything that the film director suggests. Architectural images have lost their normal human meaning as they have surrendered themselves to the service of fear. There is a hallucinatory effect in a cinematic experience, as in any artistic impact. Quote, I can no longer think what I want to think. My thoughts have been replaced by moving images, unquote. Also, real architecture directs human intentions, emotions, and thoughts by means of the hallucinatory air which it awakens. Quote, a man who concentrates before a work of art is absorbed by it, as Walter Benjamin writes. That's also the power of normal architecture, is that it creates a hallucinatory situation, which we do not notice, but the architecture becomes a frame through which we understand reality, becomes a horizon that defines meaning. That's the power of architecture. The oniric house, meaning the house of dreams, described by Gaston Bachelard in his seminal book, The Poetics of Space, has 3 or 4 floors. The middle ones are the stages of everyday life. The attic is the storage place of pleasant memories, whereas the basement is the place for negative remembrances pushed outside consciousness. This image of the multi-storied house is, of course, a metaphor of the layered structure of the human mind, not a practical design construction or instruction for us architects. In the final sequence of Hitchcock's Psycho, the different floors of the Bates house obtain their meaning in accordance with Bachelard's symbolic house. Beginning her survey of the enigma of the house in the attic, Lila, the lady, is forced to a panicked escape through the floors of the dwelling down into the basement, where she finds the terrifying, mummified, wicked corpse of Norman's mother. No, something happened. Oh. Well, it seems that I've lost the rest of my images. Hitchcock had the Bates house built on the basis of the ghostly house in Edward Hopper's painting, House by the Railway, of 1925. Somewhat earlier, Hitchcock had actually collaborated with another artist, Salvador Dali, who designed the sets for the dream sequence in Spellbound in 1945. In the Bates house, the threat posed by the house itself is concealed precisely in its bourgeois romanticism and, as Hitchcock acknowledges, in the contrast between the vulgar, horizontal modernist motel and the vertical Gothic house. I can't get the images, but never mind. The apparent rationality of the motel reinforces the dreadfulness of the Gothic house. The strategy of contrasts is also applied elsewhere in the film. The scene of the frightening murder, the gleamingly white bathroom of the motel, evokes the controlled sterility of an operating room. The white bathroom obtains the special image power through its contrast to the fathomless darkness of the adjacent bog, Norman's graveyard. That's where he buries his victims. And then I will say some words about the other cinematic master, Andrei Tarkovsky, under the title The Architecture of Erosion. As the narrative progressive, Hitchcock gradually empties the buildings of their normal emotional content, or more precisely, prevents the viewer from projecting his or her positive emotions onto them, and then he fills them with terror. Andrei Tarkovsky creates another kind of architectural metamorphosis. as he allows erosion and mold to corrode the walls, rain penetrate the roof, and water flood the floor, he takes away the building's mask of utility, which addresses our reason and common sense. He removes the inaccessible and rejecting perfection of the building and reveals the vulnerability of its structures conceived for eternity. Here I'm pointing at a problem that you probably have identified yourself. Why do newly built buildings usually feel so cold and external to us, whereas old buildings that have been have somewhat eroded and taken a patina feel cozy and friendly? Yes, the latter ones accept us with our weaknesses, whereas the new perfect buildings suggest a perfection that is alien to life. The director, here meaning Tarkovsky, makes the viewer invest his, her feelings and empathy in the naked structure. A useful building addresses our reason, whereas a ruined building awakens our imagination and unconscious fantasies. This is also the strategy of Peter Brooks, the famous British theatre director, in his violent interventions in theatre spaces. As you might know or recall, he damaged the theatre spaces by violence, ripped off surfaces, and in order to create another kind of architecture. This is what he says: a good space can't be neutral, for an impersonal sterility gives no food for the imagination. The Buffels, which was the theater he had in Paris for a long time, he vandalized the theater and turned it into a performance space. And he himself said that it has a magic and poetry of a ruin. And anyone who has allowed himself to be involved by the atmosphere of a ruin knows strongly how the imagination is let loose. Well, we all know how powerfully ruins set up images. Whereas abandoned attics, barns, and boathouses, as well as houses which have been lived in for generations, awaken our imagination and erotic fantasies, the rational matrices of concrete and steel in contemporary buildings tend to repulse them. In Herbert Marcuse's view, you might remember the famous radical social psychiatrist of the 60s, Marcuse. In his view, the vulgar sexuality and sexual violence of our time is partly due to the fact that our buildings have lost their capacity to stimulate and support positive erotic reverie. The commonplace architecture of our time has standardized emotions by eliminating the extremes of the spectrum of human feelings: melancholy and joy, bliss and grief, nostalgia and ecstasy. Tarkovsky's films revitalize our sense of the poetic. He directs the viewer to imagine the fate of the occupants who deserted their house and of the house abandoned by its residents. The terrifying 7-year imprisonment of the mathematician Domenico's family in Nostalgia, which you will see after a while, is engraved on the tormented walls of the eroded house. In that film, there is a moment when the family is released from the house after the mad father has imprisoned them 7 years in that house, and that's really shockingly powerful how that eroded building speaks about that human disaster. The eroding walls of Tarkovsky's films remember the faith of the occupants in the same way as the stains and signs left on the wall of the dismantled neighboring house in Rainer Maria Rilke's The Notebooks of Malte Lauritz Brigge tell of the life lived in the rooms of the demolished house. And this is a short excerpt from Rilke, which is one of the most powerful literary descriptions I can think of. And here the viewer is looking at a wall of a dismantled house, almost looking at nothing, but still there is this power. And this is Rilke. There stood the middays and the sicknesses and the exhaled breath and the smoke of years, and the sweat that breaks out under armpits and makes clothes heavy, and the stale breath of mouths and the fusel odor of sweltering feet. There stood the tang of urine and the burn of soot and the gray reek of potatoes, and a heavy, smooth stench of aging grease. The sweet, lingering smell of neglected infants was there, and the fierce smell of children who go to school, and the sultriness out of the beds of nubile youths. I'll end up here, and I just say I always read a chapter of this Rilke's description to my students, just to suggest that an architect could and should, in my view, develop the same kind of empathetic capacity to see human life in dead matter in the walls of a material building. I'll end here, and we are going to see, as I said, Nostalgia, which is Andrei Tarkovsky's second last film, filmed in 1983 in Italy. He left Soviet Union to make this film in Italy and never returned. He still made one film after Nostalgia, The Offer, and died soon after. Nostalgia is a film about a Russian poet who travels to Italy to make research on a 19th century Russian composer, Pavel Sosnovsky, who is an actual historical figure. And as you probably know, Russian people are very sentimental people, and nostalgia is a characteristic Russian feeling from which great Russian writers, for instance, who lived prolonged times outside of Russia, like Dostoevsky, who had to flee his indebtors, felt. And the poet is so homesick that he doesn't even notice the sexual suggestions of his Italian interpreter Eugenia, a very carnal woman, as you will see. You might pay attention to a almost unnoticeable gesture along the film. He has keys in his pocket, and he keeps handling the keys in his pocket. Those are keys to his home in Russia that he misses so badly. In a Italian little mountain town, Bagno Vignoli, they encounter the mad mathematician whom I already mentioned, Domenico. And Andrei seems to identify himself very strongly with Domenico. Domenico, who had kept his family imprisoned for 7 years, he goes to Rome, to Capitolium. He climbs up on the horse of Marcus Aurelius' statue, makes a mad speech about the madness of the world, and then doses himself with gasoline and lights himself and burns himself to death on this bronze horse. At the same time, Andrei Tarkovsky tries to make the ritual of walking across the pool in Bagno Vignoli to light up a candle on the other side of the pool. And he makes 7 attempts, and that's one shot, painfully slow. And finally he manages to light the candle, but at the same time he dies of heart attack. And again, if you watch carefully the film, you see him taking heart medication during the film. Well, I don't say anything more, but the film is a very, very deeply moving and poetic metaphor about human life altogether. And it is stunningly beautiful and inspiring. I have several times used this film in my workshops with students around the world to inspire them to approach architecture from a different point of view than geometric formalism, from the point of view of human emotions. And the projects that the students have produced, inspired by Tarkovsky, are stunning, much better than anything they have done before, and probably better than anything they will do later. I had my students in Helsinki do a 7 square meter museum for Tarkovsky located in Tallinn, in the industrial area where Stalker was filmed. I took my students there to see the industrial sites where the film was shot and then showed the film. And the museums turned out fantastically good. The exhibition of first-year students was shown in several countries internationally because the work was so inspired. I hope you will find the film inspiring. Thank you. Start right away. I'm sorry about the PowerPoint. It should have worked, but that's technology.